In late autumn of 1263, the west coast of Scotland became the stage for a confrontation that felt like the return of an older world. Not the world of castles and knights pushing borders inland, but the world of sea kings, island routes, and longships that could appear out of the mist and vanish just as quickly. The Battle of Largs is often remembered as Scotland versus Vikings, but the truth is more interesting. It was a collision between two systems of power, a Norwegian sea empire built on coastal dominance, and a Scottish kingdom expanding its authority outward, determined to pull the Western Isles into a tighter national orbit. To understand why Largs mattered, you have to picture the western seaboard as medieval sailors saw it. The Hebrides, Kintyre, Arran, Bute, and the Isle of Man were not remote edges of the map. They were stepping stones across the sea, controlling travel, trade, and military movement. Whoever held them could shape the politics of the entire region. For Norway, these islands were part of the Sudreyjar, the Southern Isles, linked to a Norse Gaelic culture that had formed over centuries. Norway's kings did not rule every inlet directly, but their claim of overlordship was real, supported by tribute, alliances, and the threat of force. Local lords governed day-to-day life, often blending Norse and Gaelic identity, but their legitimacy sat under the shadow of Norwegian power. Scotland, meanwhile, was changing fast. By the mid-13th century, Scottish kings were consolidating their realm with a new confidence. King Alexander III inherited a kingdom with momentum and ambition. He wanted the Western Isles not just for prestige, but because they were strategically vital. Control of those sea routes meant security, taxation, and influence over regions that had long existed in a semi-independent maritime world. Scotland pressed its claim, and Norway resisted. There were negotiations, delays, and diplomatic maneuvering, but the tension kept rising. At some point, King Haakon IV of Norway decided that talk was no longer enough. If Scotland wanted to test Norway's authority in the west, Norway would answer with a fleet so large it would make the question feel ridiculous. In 1263, Håkon sailed with a massive expedition. The exact number of ships varies by source, but accounts describe an armada of intimidating scale, far beyond a typical raiding force. This was not a quick strike. It was a political performance backed by real military capability, longships, crews, warriors, supplies, and the authority of a king who expected obedience from the islands and respect from Scotland. The logic was simple. Norway's strength was on the water. Longships could land men almost anywhere, shift position quickly, and threaten multiple points along a coast. A fleet like Haakon's could force Scotland to react, could pressure local lords into renewed allegiance, and could impose terms without needing a decisive land battle. But even the greatest fleet has a weakness. Fleets are not armies that live off fields and roads. They depend on safe anchorage, stable weather, food, repair, and timing. They are powerful when they are moving, and vulnerable when they are forced to wait. And as Håkon moved into the waters around the Firth of Clyde, the Scottish response was unusually disciplined. The Scots did not panic into a reckless shoreline fight. They watched, they gathered, they kept their forces on favorable ground, and they allowed the campaign to drift into the most dangerous season of the Scottish year. Autumn storms were not an inconvenience. They were a strategic threat as real as any enemy formation. The critical moment at Largs was not a grand plan drawn on a war table. It was weather. An autumn gale blew hard into the Clyde. For ships anchored near a coastline, this kind of storm could undo months of preparation in a single night. Anchors could drag, ships could collide, waves could shove vessels toward rocks and sand. A fleet that looked invincible in calm water could suddenly become a cluttered, damaged mass fighting simply to survive. Several of Håkon's ships were driven ashore near Largs. Imagine what that meant tactically. A longship was more than transport. It was mobility, retreat, supply, and status all built into one wooden body. If a ship went aground, it could be wrecked, looted, or burned. It could strand its crew. It could create panic through the fleet because every beached vessel was proof that the sea was no longer under Norwegian control. And for the Scots, those beached ships were an invitation. An enemy army caught low, on a shoreline, in storm conditions, was an enemy army suddenly vulnerable to attack. The Scottish forces were positioned on higher ground, watching the coast. From there, they had visibility and advantage. They could choose their moment. They could descend in strength, strike the exposed Norsemen, and make the beach a killing ground. This was not going to be a clean, symmetrical battle. It was going to be rough, wet, and chaotic. Exactly the kind of fight where discipline and terrain matter more than heroic charges. When the Scots attacked, the conflict became the kind of combat that medieval chroniclers often struggle to describe clearly because it doesn't fit the neat pattern of armies meet, lines clash, victory declared. This was closer to a coastal brawl with strategic consequences. Norse crews scrambled to protect the ships and recover equipment while also trying to form some kind of defensive position. Men were dealing with wind and rain in their faces, unstable footing, and the constant pressure of waves. Some were fighting, some were hauling ropes, some were dragging supplies, some were trying to refloat vessels, or at least strip them of anything valuable before the Scots could seize it. The Scots, attacking from more stable ground, could surge forward and fall back as needed. They could press the advantage and force the Norse into defensive clusters. They could threaten the ships directly, which was often more valuable than simply trying to kill as many men as possible. Because if you damage a fleet's ability to move, you don't just win a skirmish, you change the entire campaign. And on that shoreline at Largs, the Norse did not have the comfortable certainty of a planned landing. They had the grim urgency of men trying to hold a collapsing situation together. This is why both sides could later claim something like victory. The Norse could argue that they fought off the attack, regrouped, and withdrew in organized fashion rather than being annihilated. The Scots could argue that they struck when the Norse were exposed, forced them off the shoreline, and prevented the Norwegian king from achieving a decisive political outcome. When a battle is a messy skirmish, perception matters, and so does the broader strategic result. The question is not only who held the beach at sunset, but who left the campaign stronger than before. After the fighting, Håkon faced a worsening reality. The autumn season was not ending, it was beginning. The longer he remained, the greater the risk that his ships would be shredded by wind and waves without gaining anything worth the cost. Even if his men could win a fight on land, the environment was attacking his ships every day. That is the hidden opponent in this story, not Scotland alone, but Scotland's coastline in autumn, which can punish even the most confident commander. So Håkon withdrew northward with his fleet. The expedition that was meant to impose authority was now under pressure just to return safely. He reached Orkney, and in Kirkwall he stayed, waiting, recovering, reassessing. But the campaign never regained its momentum. The political display of force had turned into a struggle against time, weather, and diminishing returns. In December of 1263, not long after the campaign, King Haakon IV died in Orkney. That single event amplified the significance of logs far beyond the shoreline clash itself. Medieval power was not only measured in ships and warriors, it depended on leadership, succession, and the will to sustain long, expensive pressure campaigns. A king's death could drain momentum from a policy overnight, not because the kingdom vanished, but because priorities shifted, factions moved, and the next ruler inherited problems instead of progress. It is important to be clear about what logs was and what it was not. It was not a decisive annihilation like the great battlefield legends people often imagine. Scotland did not win the Hebrides in a single afternoon of slaughter. Logs was a turning point because it revealed limits. It exposed the vulnerability of a maritime expedition in hostile seasonal conditions. It prevented Norway from achieving a clean, confident settlement on its own terms, and it contributed to a shift in which Norway's hold over the Western Isles became harder to justify, harder to enforce, and increasingly costly to maintain. What followed was not immediate conquest, but a political outcome shaped by the changing balance of power. In 1266, Norway and Scotland agreed to the Treaty of Perth. Norway ceded the Hebrides and the Isle of Man to Scotland in exchange for compensation, while Norway retained control of Orkney and Shetland. That treaty, more than any single blow at logs, marks the formal transfer of authority and the end of a long era in which Norway could credibly claim the Western Isles as part of its sphere. And this is where the story becomes richer than a simple Vikings lose, Scots win headline. The western seaboard was not a neat binary world. The Isles had long been a Norse Gaelic frontier zone with blended identities, languages, and loyalties. Local rulers had navigated between powers for generations, balancing allegiance, opportunity, and survival. When Scotland brought the Isles under its authority, it was not flipping a cultural switch. It was absorbing a region with its own deep hybrid history, shaped as much by sea routes as by royal proclamations. So why does logs matter? Because it marks the beginning of the end of Norway's ability to project power deep into Scotland's west. It shows how weather and geography can act like an army, turning strength into vulnerability. It highlights Scotland's strategic patience, not meeting a maritime giant where it was strongest, but waiting for a moment when the environment and terrain tilted the odds. And it shows how small battles can matter when they connect to larger political shifts. The skirmish itself may have been chaotic and limited, but its consequences were not. If you want a final image to hold in your mind, don't picture a clean field of banners and ranks. Picture the shoreline after the clash. Wet sand churned into mud under boots, salt spray stinging faces, torn sailcloth snapping violently, broken oars and scattered gear half buried in the surf, men shouting to be heard over the wind, wounded dragged toward shelter, ships sitting at angles they were never meant to sit, their hulls strained and scraping, the seas still roaring as if it doesn't care who claims the islands. That is the heart of logs, a battle shaped by friction, wind, water, terrain, timing, where victory was less about a single dramatic moment and more about what became impossible afterward. Norway did not fall in a day, and Scotland did not seize the West with one decisive strike. But after logs, the direction of the story changed. The age of Norse control over Scotland's Western Isles was beginning to fade, not with a perfect battlefield triumph, but with a storm, stranded longships, and a kingdom ready to turn that chaos into an advantage.